All right, everybody. Welcome to episode 19 of Life Lessons in Combat Sports. I'm Eric Hamidi, your host as usual, to give you another tale about the realm of combat sports and relaying some type of life lesson that goes along with it. Although, as you may have seen from the last episode, we're just picking up where we left off as far as talking about the Muhammad Ali Act and the things that are going on with it at this time. So, I want to get right into the episode because there's a lot of information, but something of a disclaimer that I would say is that if you haven't seen episode 18 yet, I would strongly recommend that you go ahead and watch that before watching this one because it will provide context for everything I'm talking about in that episode. That's the one where we talked about the Ali Act and what it encompasses and what it's about or what it does and all this other stuff. So I would recommend that you do that. It's kind of like watching the prequel before the sequel, if you will. So that's just one of the things I want to get out of the way right from the get-go. The other thing that I wanted to say is that a lot of this information that I'm using for these last two episodes, rather, these are from a podcast I follow called Hey Not the Face that has John Nash and Steffi Haynes on there. It's basically a combat sports business podcast, and I discovered it over the summer. I really enjoy it, and they gave me a little bit of a shout out in their episode that came out on October 17th. So I just wanted to thank them for that. In my previous episode, I gave a little bit of an example as far as what a boxing promotion is, and I only listed Top Rank, but some other ones that come to mind are like a Golden Boy Promotions, which is run by Oscar De La Hoya. There is Matchroom, which is run by Eddie Hearn, and then there's Queensberry Promotions by Frank Warren. So those are boxing promotions, and to the best of my knowledge, promotion, whether it's a boxing promotion or MMA promotion, is they're in charge of housing the fight. They're in charge of the broadcast deal. They're in charge of the contracts. They're basically housing the fight, while a sanctioning organization like a World Boxing Organization, a World Boxing Association, World Boxing Council. It's kind of hard to keep track of all these names, to be perfectly honest with you. They're in charge of rankings and championships, ratings, criteria, rule set. I mean, maybe I'm a little off when it comes to that, but to the best of my knowledge, those are the things that they're in charge of. So I kind of feel like maybe I didn't do a good enough job explaining that in the previous episode. So with those disclaimers out of the way, I figure let's just get right into the heart of the episode. So like I said, we're picking up where we left off on episode 18. What I want to just briefly do is just give a quick overview of what the Ali Act is. I mean, I'm not going to go into detail as far as what it is. You can watch episode 18 for that. But basically what the Ali Act is, the full name is the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act. And it was a law put into place in the year 2000 to basically help protect boxers from promoter abuse. So it called for certain things like financial disclosures, how much money was coming into the event, medical record disclosure, putting in certain protections to prevent conflicts of interest between a manager and a promoter, as in a manager and a promoter can't be one and the same, and someone who's in a sanctioning organization can't receive compensation from a promotion. So it had all these things in place. Also, it helped protect from coercive contracts, which, like I kind of mentioned in the previous episode, it's basically these conditions, if you will, where they say, I mean, sometimes in the past, before this law was enacted, there would be instances where promoters would say, I have a champion under contract to my promotion, and if you want to fight him or her, then you got to sign a deal with me and a long multi-fight contract with option extensions and all this other stuff. So the Muhammad Ali Act, it prevented that from happening, or it gave a certain time limit on coercive contracts if they were in fact offered to fighters. So that's where we were with the Ali Act, and I feel like I feel like I've kind of been thinking about this quite a lot. I will say is that The problems, I mean, what happened was that there were some problems with the Ali Act as far as enforcement goes, and that became evident pretty quickly. And some of the problems that it had was, for instance, it was a lack of enforcement, there was lack of resources to help enforce it, and there was limited financing for it, and there's still ways that, honestly, promoters kind of find all these loopholes to work around it. So those are some of the flaws that are in the Ali Act. But what ended up happening was, and this is in particular where I left off in the previous episode, in the early 2010s, there was a movement or an amendment that was proposed called the Professional Boxing Amendment Act. And this was to amend the Ali Act as we know it. And this was supposed to help solve some of the problems that were present from the Ali Act. So the Professional Boxing Amendment Act, what it was going to do was introduce a federal boxing commission to oversee athletic commissions and promotions. They had certain rules or criteria to license sanctioning organizations. They also had the ability to take those away if they didn't comply with their rules, or if they fell short on what they needed to do. And it was also going to ask for better rankings, and it was also going to have some improved protections for boxers. And in a weird way, it kind of has some of the stuff that is in this Muhammad Ali Revival Act. We'll get to that in a second. But it's sort of like a better option as far as making improvements on some of the flaws that the Ali Act has, but while still protecting the rights of boxers and all that stuff. So that was something that was really pushed by John McCain. As I mentioned in the previous episode, he was a big boxing fan. But the thing about it was that while it was drafted, it never actually got passed into law. And there were a lot of different groups or promotions that lobbied against it. So for instance, athletic commissions, they were against it because they didn't want to basically have to answer to a higher up. They didn't want to lose their power or influence. Same thing with the Association of Boxing Commission, the ABC, and then similar reasons for boxing promotions. And one group in particular that lobbied against it, according to Hey Not the Face, was Zuffa, who at the time, they were the parent company for UFC. And the theory about that is that they lobbied against it because they were afraid that one day it was gonna relate to, or not relate, but it was gonna include MMA, and that would interfere with the way that they had been doing business at the time, and they didn't want any federal oversight into the way that they did business. So Zuffa, back when they were just running the UFC, they were against it as well. So time goes on, and like I said, it never got passed. So we fast forward. In 2016, Zuffa sells the UFC to Endeavor. They purchased the company for $4 billion, so they now run it. And then several years later, Endeavor also buys WWE. What ends up happening is that a new group is created as a subsidiary of Endeavor, and it's called TKO. And they oversee WWE and UFC now that they both have the same owners. And what happened over the summer was that, well, before we even get into that, so TKO, they announced that they want to get into boxing. And now that's where we end up here with what happened over the summer. There was an amendment that was introduced by Georgia's Brian Jack and Kansas's Sharice Davis. And what they introduced was the amendment that's in the news right now as far as the boxing world goes. It's called the Muhammad Ali American Boxing Revival Act. And there's a lot of different ways to go about this. I think what I'll do here is that kind of just give a little bit of an overview as far as what it allows and some of the other kind of provisions that are involved with it. So what the Ali Act revival does is that it's an amendment that is offering more health and safety protections for boxers. It's offering more insurance, health care, and pay standards for them. And then it's also, what this act also is calling for is the creation of something called a Unified Boxing Organization, a UBO. I'll get into details as far as what that is in just a moment. But some of the provisions that the amendment is calling for is a $25,000 injury insurance for the day of the fight that all promoters have to have. It's also calling for a pay standard for $150 a round, and it's also asking for it's offering certified judges and referees. And these things are things that all boxing promotions or boxing groups would have to follow, whether you're a regular boxing promotion like Matchroom, who goes by the Ali Act, or if you become a UBO, you have to abide by all this stuff. And now we go into what exactly a UBO is. And it's basically an entity that can act as a sanctioning organization and a promotion. So as opposed to those two things being separate under the current version of the Ali Act with the Muhammad Ali American Boxing Revival Act. I mean, that's a long title, so from here on out, we're just going to call it the Revival Act. Under the Revival Act, you can become something called a UBO, and there's certain criteria for that, but what I mean is that there are certain criteria that you have to follow in order to operate as a UBO. So, to the best of my knowledge, a UBO would basically take all the responsibilities of a sanctioning organization and a boxing promotion and into one. And basically, the best way you could describe it is it would be as if UFC was in boxing, or if you had a boxing company operating like UFC, because in mixed martial arts, they don't have the same kind of provisions or protections for the Ali Act like they do for the sport of boxing. So the UFC, they can arrange matchups, they can make their own rankings, they can issue championships, all that other stuff. This is an Ali Act exemption if you meet certain conditions in order to be a UBO. And some of the things that it's asking for, or just basically the way that you become a UBO, is if, for instance, you have a training and rehab center, if you administer additional tests, cover the costs of them, if you offer injury and accident insurance during training for a boxer. So as opposed to just providing injury insurance for the day of the fight, you also provide insurance for your athletes as they're training leading up to the fight. So if let's say Canelo is prepping for a fight and he's training for a fight, and then 2 months before the fight day he gets injured, he would get insurance for that. And it's a certain amount. I'm not exactly sure how much that is, but that's something that you would need to offer if you want to be a UBO. And then there's a requirement to have a minimum number of ambulances and doctors on site for a given event. You have to administer your own drug testing. You have to have additional medical tests. So these are all the things that you would need to do if you want to be a UBO. And the only reason I'm laughing right now is just because that just so happens to be all the things that the UFC under TKO already do and already provide their fighters. So there's a lot of concerns or theories here about what this is sort of going to lead into, and I'll get into that in a moment. But I just want to say that if you do in fact become a UBO, then you are exempt from the Ali Act. All of the things and the provisions that it has, they don't apply to a UBO. So basically, because TKO's new boxing venture, which is called TKO Boxing. There was a time, or no, sorry, I'm completely messing that up, sorry. Okay, sorry. TKO's new boxing venture is going to be Zuffa Boxing. And there was a time where we thought it was going to be called TKO Boxing, but apparently it's going to be called Zuffa Boxing. And I guess that's to, honor the legacy or just honor the ambition that Dana White always had to get Zuffa Boxing up and running, something like that. But anyway, a UBO doesn't have to worry about sanctioning bodies. They don't have to worry about conflicts of interest between titles and promoters. The coercive contracts, kind of like what I described earlier, is that these UBOs, they wouldn't have to worry about that. They can just kind of conduct business however they would like, basically. So if you meet the criteria to be a UBO, like I just mentioned, the things that you would be allowed to do would be that basically you can have your own championships and rankings. So instead of there being the WBC or the WBA heavyweight champion, you would be the Zuffa Boxing heavyweight champion. They will administer their own anti-doping. Like I kind of mentioned, the UBOs, they don't need to worry about sanctioning organizations. They can basically operate independent of them. So that's where having their own rankings and titles come into play. So the other thing that it would allow for, coercive contracts to be legal. Now, I kind of already described what the coercive contract is, but just to give you an example, even more, just to kind of really give you a clear example of what that would be like. We had, for instance, we had Anthony Joshua and Alexander Usyk have a fight. They had a couple fights against each other. And then you had Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury. They had a series of fights together. Let's say, for instance, Usyk and Joshua, they were signed to Top Rank. And then Fury and Wilder, they were signed with Zuffa Boxing in this hypothetical scenario. If Zuffa Boxing and Top Rank were UBOs, then what we ended up getting as far as Fury fighting Usyk, they fought each other a couple times last year. Under this UBO model, we wouldn't get that. And that's because a UBO athlete can only fight another UBO athlete within that same umbrella or within that same group. So because they're on one side here with TKO Box, I keep saying TKO, sorry about that. Because they're on one side with Zuffa Boxing and then you had the others on Top Rank, there would be no co-promotion. And that's a concern that a lot of people are raising about this new Revival Act, is the fact that it almost prohibits co-promotion. In addition to UBO athletes only being able to compete with one another, there's no mandatory challengers and there's no protection from coercive contracts, because those coercive contracts, the protections against them, those are only applicable to boxers who are not under contract with you. So what this basically means is that, Jesus Christ, it doesn't get rid of the original Ali Act. It just provides an exemption or an alternative to comply, as some boxing experts will say. So any boxing promoter who doesn't qualify to be a UBO, which is a very realistic problem, because a lot of the things that you would need to be a UBO, other boxing promotions wouldn't be able to do that. For instance, Top Rank, or I mean, I think they have a little bit of a gym there, but for instance, Matchroom, they don't have a training or rehab center. They would have to build one, which obviously is going to cost money and all that stuff, where the UFC, they already have that. or being able to offer the injury insurance. I mean, that's another added cost for all these boxing promotions that TKO already does with the juggernaut that they have as far as the revenue coming in from WWE and UFC, which, you know, UFC has kind of reached the level that they have through very questionable and monopolistic actions. Basically, what happens is that if these boxing promotions they don't qualify to be a UBO, then they'll still be expected, or they'll have to comply by the Ali Act provisions. Here's another problem that I would have is that if both boxers are under contract, then there's no mandatory challengers. So in boxing, because it has federal oversight and has all these laws in place, if there is someone who's ranked number one by one of the boxing sanctioning organizations, then they have to compete for the championship. But if you're under this UBO model and all that stuff, then you don't need to do that, and that's not going to happen. What's interesting about this Revival Act is the fact that it's saying that you have to do all these things to be a UBO. And these are things that that TKO just so happens to have. Like all the things that you would need to have in order to be a UBO, or all the things you would need to do, TKO is already able to do that. UFC is already able to do that. So there's a concern here that this is not something that other boxing promotions would be able to do. So with the fact that TKO can do all this stuff, that gives them a head start into all of this. And there's a lot of concern going around as far as why are they trying to change the law in the first place? And I mean, it just seems very questionable that, for instance, the UFC, they settled a antitrust lawsuit for $375 million for underpaying their fighters. And then they're basically introducing this new bill that says, oh, if we do X, Y, and Z, then we can operate differently than all other boxing promotions. And there's a concern that this is a long-term play. And something I should say is that the provisions that are in the Ali Act, this Revival Act, I mean, it seems like it's a good thing if you're an up-and-coming boxer, but there's some concern as far as the long-term play that is going to happen that will affect higher income boxers when you become your Canelos and your Crawfords and all that other stuff. So there's a belief that basically what TKO may do is that they may pay a lot of money in the beginning to sign all these boxers like your Canelos and Crawfords to their own organization. And then while they have them under contract, they have their up-and-coming boxers who are climbing up the ranks and all that stuff. And eventually what may happen is that you have, I don't know, Jacob Smith, whatever, you have him rise up the ranks, and then he beats Canelo, and then he takes the mantle of being the best boxer. And to be honest, that all has a bit of a trickle effect that a lot of people are concerned about, that we've already kind of seen in MMA. So the kind of effect that it has is, okay, from a boxer standpoint, let's say, for instance, you have Canelo signed to your organization. Other boxers, they're going to want to fight against him in order to reach the type of prestige or financial reward that all boxers want to get in the sport. So they may be all like, oh, hey, I'm just going to sign with Zuffa Boxing. And then over time, as more and more people do that, then everything becomes centralized with Zuffa Boxing. Because, I mean, quite honestly, from a boxer perspective, if you have the best fighters, then you're going to want to fight them. That depletes a lot of resources from all these other organizations. And, you know, a lot of this is just kind of, I mean, a lot of this is concern and theories and all that stuff, but I think it's very realistic, basically. So the concern from, I guess I'll finish up by saying that from an athletic perspective, or from a, you know, health of the sport aspect, if you have all these boxers who sign on to you due to being forced to do it or naivety or whatever it may be, then there isn't as much there isn't as much interest or credibility to any organization outside of Zuffa boxing. So that eventually leads to a point where everything is centralized with one entity, both from an athlete perspective and then also from a fan perspective, that basically it opens the door for a monopoly to take over in boxing. And the fact that all the conditions to be a UBO just so happen to be something that UFC and TKO already are, that raises a red flag. And I can see that happening because, I mean, if I may bestow my opinion here, is that I think what's happened is that within MMA, because there are no federal laws and rules regarding contracts and all that stuff, slowly but surely, everybody and all the best fighters, they're just in UFC, which has created a perception from a public standpoint that, oh, you know, the UFC is the only place that has the best fighters. And that creates less interest and less money to go around, and it's almost like to the point where everybody just wants to be involved or, you know, be associated with UFC, and then UFC just becomes this self-sustaining business, to the point where, okay, everybody wants to be involved with them, but if we can't be involved with the biggest organization, then we're just not going to get we're just not going to be involved with MMA at all. And that causes less coverage from sports websites. I mean, I've heard of a lot of people who are in MMA media who are struggling to make a living for themselves. And I think that's just because, you know, the UFC is just where all the interest is. That's where all the attention and where the money is. So there's not that investment in the sport of MMA. And people are concerned that this is what's going to happen within boxing. I don't know. There's a lot of chicanery going on here. Like I said, it seems very shady that the things that you would want to do, the things that you would need to have in order to be a UBO, just so happen to be things that you already have. So, and what's also crazy about this is the fact that if this if this act gets passed, then it becomes a law in 30 days, where the original Ali Act, it took 2 years for it to finally be enacted. So yeah, I mean, there's that concern. I mean, the UFC already is basically the NBA or the NFL of MMA, and that could happen here over time with Zuffa boxing, that they become the NBA or the NFL, and you know, you just associate Zuffa boxing with, oh, that's where the best athletes in that given sport, that's where they compete. So why am I going to watch anything that's not that? Because it's just anything other than that is second tier. And you know, it works for leagues like the NBA or NFL and all that stuff, where it's just like, yeah, they have, I'm going to quote Luke Thomas here, who's another individual who I've gotten some of this information from, in addition to Hey Not the Face. He has noted that, yeah, those leagues, they're monopolies in their given sport, but the athletes have protections and they have a union, so they can negotiate fair conditions for themselves. So that's where the major difference is. And I mean, as a combat sports fan, I mean, this is something that I'm concerned about, and I kind of share the fears that this is going to happen. So now that I have gone through all of that, now we get to the point of what is the lesson that this sort of teaches us. I mean, there is one aspect of this as far as, okay, you need to read through documents and stuff like that. And yeah, that is kind of applicable here, but that seems a little simplistic. And I feel like we can take it a step further. There's more to that. I mean, this might be the one episode that I do where, to be honest, there may be multiple life lessons that I share with y'all. But what it's kind of, I mean, here's the thing, here's the problem that I'm sort of seeing is that boxers, and then also what we've seen very recently, what happened with the California State Athletic Commission. Now, some of that may be also due to chicanery, but if nothing else, you know, if we just go with what was said or what have you, then I feel like what's happening with individuals who are involved with boxing in some way, or if it's the boxers themselves, I honestly think what's happening is that they're just looking at those health benefits that the Revival Act has, and they're just focusing on that, or just that's the only thing that's getting attention. So they're not really looking too deep into what the Revival Act also has, or what it entails, or what it means. And I think that's the key thing, the key point of this particular episode, is to just really stress to people, you have to look beneath the surface of things. We see that happening here with the Revival Act in the sense of people see, oh, hey, we're going to offer increased injury insurance or have more health insurance. We're going to have pay minimums for boxers. And they just kind of get so distracted by that that there's a little bit of a lack of seeing the bigger picture here. And the bigger picture, when you look at the other conditions and the other clauses of the Revival Act, that should, or that could, or that may bring up concern in you. Where, okay, it's almost like you get kind of distracted by something shiny that you just think, oh, hey, I'm just going to support this. I'm just going to go ahead with it. But you have to look at things more extensively. You have to look at things more broadly. And like I kind of say, look beneath the surface of things. It's like, okay, whether it's like, okay, why do they want to pass this amendment, or what else is involved with it, or just what have you. I mean, there is a factor of, or there is a facet to this of, oh, hey, are they really reading the entire thing and kind of like understanding it, or kind of understanding the contractual lingo here to really understand what this means? I just feel like there's a concern there, or I just feel like that's maybe not happening as much. And this is kind of a thing that I mean, I'm just going to throw this disclaimer out there. Far be it of me to provide any type of advice to professional athletes and all that stuff, but seeing what I've seen within MMA, where a lot of people, they kind of got a little blinded by the glitz and glamour, or sort of like, oh, hey, we're getting paid $50,000 for a certain bout, whatever it is. My suggestion for any boxers, if this amendment gets passed, my recommendation is that you should really think about what it would mean to be with Zuffa Boxing, or what it would mean to have a contract with them, and what could possibly happen. Because, a lot of this stuff they have here, I mean, it's good if you're like an up-and-coming boxer, but then the concern that a lot of people are having is that as TKO, as Zuffa Boxing gets more and more boxers, then everything becomes concentrated with just them, and then when they have all the power and control, they can dictate all the terms, so they may shortchange people as time goes on. And with the time that I have remaining, I don't have a good example of myself as far as how just having these sort of ideas in mind are applicable, but I can share an experience that someone I know of has, where basically this person, he was in the market to buy a car, and they got to the point where, okay, it looked like there was a deal being made and everything was finalized. So they were trying to get financing approved for the car, and he was reviewing the paperwork for it. And as he was reading through it, he came across, like, basically this was a document that he thought it would just give them authorization to check his credit in order to finance the car. So he's reading through it, and then he comes across this part that just basically says, in simple terms, you're not going to get approved for financing based on your credit score. And when he asked about that and was saying, what does that mean? The dealer was saying, oh, you don't need to worry about it. You'll get approved for it regardless. And then he was pointing out that, well, that's not what it says in the contract. And then when push comes to shove, any company they're working with, they're just going to go off of what's in writing. So he brings that up, and then the dealer just says, oh, hey, this is a standard clause that's written in our documents. And then he was saying, well, he hasn't seen anything like that in his experience buying cars. And then basically the dealer was saying, you're being really difficult, and just it was becoming a hassle, and said basically that he didn't want to like work with him, all because he was just going off of what was in writing, which if you're smart about it, that's what you do. I mean, it should be a given. They're going to go off of what's in writing. But had he not considered that, had he not found that part in that document, and had he just quite honestly taken the person's word for it, which is a problem. I mean, that's a general problem and a general theme with this entire issue, is that I feel like, and this is something that's kind of becoming a little more apparent for me, is that if you're just relying, like, let's say for instance, a monopoly is achieved in boxing where Zuffa Boxing is the only company. I mean, if they have all the power and control, if you're relying on them to pay you a high salary from their own volition out of the kindness of their heart, I mean, that is a very wrong way of thinking, and I would not suggest that somebody does that. So that example that I just told you, I mean, that's an example of, reading through the documents and all that stuff, but it's also dealing with, okay, let's look at this part and see, what does that mean? And when I kind of think about it with this Revival Act, it's kind of applicable here, because there's a part in there where it says you can basically act independent from any sanctioning organization. But you would have to think, what does that mean? Or what could that entail? Or as one wrestling manager that I watched an interview from one time, Paul Heyman, he put it in a way that's like, where could the deal go wrong? And I think that's very applicable here with this whole Revival Act, is that you want to think about, where can it go wrong? So that's an important thing that I would want to stress about this. And to be honest, I think another thing is that you don't want to just brush things off. And I guess with that car buying experience I just shared with you, when the dealer was saying, oh, hey, you'll get approved anyway, they weren't just like, oh, yeah, okay, well, let's do it. They inquired about it and, investigated and all that stuff. That is another important thing to keep in mind for life. I think that's also applicable to, I mean, once again, far be it of me to say this to anyone who specializes in it, but any type of politician or athletic commission or all that stuff. I mean, I think it would be great if they weren't just looking at this and thinking, oh, yeah, okay, whatever. I'll just take, I'll just sign it, get out of the way. We have more important things. I mean, like, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, there are more important things to think about, but I don't know. I just kind of hope that there isn't that dismissiveness where it's like, okay, I know that all this may seem ridiculous or they're not a fan of it or what have you, but don't just brush it off. That's kind of something that I'm just putting out there in the universe there. And I think between all the things that I'm saying, you want to the most important thing I'm getting at, just in general for anyone who's watching this, is that you want to look beneath the surface of matters, and you kind of want to think about just really all the things I'm kind of been applying here, where it's like you think, okay, how can things go wrong, or what does this actually mean? You want to just investigate. I think that's a very key thing here. And whether it's the provisions that are in the Revival Act or what's included in an actual Zuffa boxing contract, you really want to just see, what do these things mean and what could happen for me, which is something that I don't know. I just feel like is not really happening a whole lot in the boxing community when it comes to this. So, in general, in your own life, I mean, the simplest way that I can put it, and just like kind of what it branches off into everything as, is that you want to just read through documents. You want to read the thing that you're signing, and then I guess even just, I mean, I think this is a good way to put it. I'm kind of happy I'm coming up with this. Just in addition to just reading what's on the document or seeing a certain clause, how it's written, you want to think about the applicability of it. That's a very important thing that I would want to also stress to y'all. And I mean, just cards on the table. I'm not in support of this Revival Act because I can see the problems that can come up with it, and just being an MMA fan for as long as I have, I mean, I've kind of seen that sort of like centralized, self-sustaining business rising in a sport. And I mean, that's kind of caused a little bit of problem, even, to be honest, especially for, even for somebody like myself who is venturing into MMA media. The one thing that I kind of want to say real quick, for anyone who's watching this, is that if you want to take some kind of action to oppose this Revival Act, you can sign a petition that's going around for the Ali Expansion Act, which is basically that extends protections from the Ali Act into other combat sports athletes like mixed martial artists and all that other stuff. I signed that petition a few months ago. I'll include a link of that in the video description. You can also, if you feel passionate about this enough, you can write to your congressperson talking about this bill. Hopefully, between these two episodes, if you have the information needed to write your own letter, if that's something that you choose to do. And then if there are any public hearings that a state athletic commission is doing, if there's an opportunity for a public comment, you want to, you can call in and then give your comments on it when the time comes. And then also, I mean, anyone in the boxing industry, I mean, I think there's a little bit more of a, concerted effort that they need to make as far as opposing this as well. Those are the biggest ways that you can help. These are all things that I've done as well to try to oppose the Ali Act. And it's just because I guess where I'm coming from is that I want there to be opportunities for people outside of Zuffa boxing or just outside of UFC. I kind of want it to be that, I mean, I would like for it to be that it's like, if we take another sport, for example, okay, you may not work for the NBA, but you can still get work as an NBA writer for different sports websites or, different media companies and stuff like that. But because the UFC has become its own self-sustaining business, there isn't that kind of investment there. So I would like to see that changed, and I definitely would not want to see the Revival Act changed. This has been quite a project, I will say. There's a lot of work that I've been doing as far as figuring out everything about the Ollie Act and the Revival Act. And I just hope it's apparent in these episodes. I hope you have enjoyed them. I hope they were informative. Once again, I have to give a lot of credit to John Nash and Luke Thomas. Those are the individuals that I've gotten the most information on when it comes to this matter. Just Hey Not the Face in general. I mean, I think that's a great podcast. Check them out. They're on Substack. So once again, that's hosted by John Nash and Steffi Haynes. And yeah, it's been fun. It's been fun looking into this whole boxing history or boxing industry and all that other stuff. It's something that, to be honest, I didn't have like a ton of information about it before I started doing all this stuff. But now I feel as though I'm a little more informed about it, which kind of enhances the amount of knowledge I have about combat sports. So looking forward to adding to that. And once again, that's kind of why that's why there's been such a gap in between all these different episodes. But I'm hoping I can get back into the regular flow of things. But yeah, that's everything about the Ollie Act. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode and the previous one. Let me know what you think about it. You can leave your comments down in the comments section below. Subscribe to my videos. If you want to find me on social media, I am on Instagram, Life and Combat Sports. And we'll be back again soon. All right, I'll catch you guys on the next one. See ya.